Japan's oldest chronicle describes the afterlife not as one place but as 5, a vertical map of territories the soul descends through, or becomes trapped inside. The 4th territory has no exit. No Japanese text records anyone returning from it. The scribes offered no explanation. They simply wrote it down as fact. And when scholars placed that map beside the Mesopotamian underworld of the Anunnaki, something unexpected appeared. 2 traditions, 2 ends of Eurasia, no contact between the civilizations that produced them. And yet the architecture of the dead as each recorded it matches in ways that 3,000 years of scholarship has not fully explained. The clay tablets from King Ashurbanipal's library now sit in cases at the British Museum in London. Visitors walk past them every day. The cuneiform on their surfaces describes a text called the Descent of Inanna, one of the oldest written narratives in human history, dated to approximately 1900 BCE in its surviving form, though the oral tradition it records is older. The text follows the goddess Inanna as she descends through 7 sequential gates into the underworld, the domain of her sister Ereshkigal. At each gate, a specific item is stripped from her: her crown, her rod of lapis lazuli, her necklace, her breastplate, her golden ring, her measuring rod, her royal garment. By the time she stands before Ereshkigal's throne, she has been reduced to nothing. Ereshkigal kills her. Inanna is hung on a hook and left to rot. The translator Diane Volkstein and the scholar Samuel Noah Kramer, working from the original Sumerian tablets for their 1983 edition, noted that the stripping at each gate is not merely symbolic. The objects removed are items of cosmic authority. Each gate removes a layer of Inanna's capacity to act in the world. What the underworld strips is not clothing. It is identity. Incrementally, deliberately, gate by gate until nothing retrievable remains. The Kojiki describes something structurally identical without ever having heard of Inanna. The Kojiki is Japan's oldest written chronicle, compiled in 712 CE by a court official named O no Yasumaro, transcribing oral tradition carried by a memorizer named Hieda no Are. When the god Izanagi enters Yomi, the Japanese land of the dead, to retrieve his wife Izanami, he finds her in a state of decay. Her body is colonized by maggots. 8 thunder deities have generated from different parts of her rotting flesh. He runs, he escapes. He seals the entrance to Yomi with a great boulder, but what he saw was only the upper threshold. The translator Donald Filippi, in his 1968 edition of the Kojiki published by the University of Tokyo Press, noted in his annotations that the text implies further descent beyond what Izanagi witnessed. Izanami was standing at the threshold when he fled. The text does not describe what lies behind her. Whatever exists deeper in Yomi, Izanagi never reached it. No other figure in the Kojiki does either. Both traditions contain the same structural feature. A living figure descends toward the dead. The upper threshold is described in vivid physical detail. The lower reaches are not described, not because the scribes forgot, because the lower reaches function in both systems as a space that cannot be reported from. This pattern is not coincidence, it is architecture. Ichiro Hori, the Japanese religious scholar whose 1968 work on folk religion in Japan remains a standard reference at the University of Chicago Press, documented a persistent belief across pre-Buddhist Japanese communities in a layered vertical afterlife of at least 5 distinct territories. This belief predates Buddhist influence on Japan entirely. It appears in regional documents called Fudoki, compiled in the 8th century and translated by Michiko Aoki in 1997, which preserve cosmological traditions from different Japanese provinces. The Fudoki accounts are inconsistent in minor detail, but consistent in structure. The soul moves downward. The territories become progressively less accessible to the living world, and the lowest territories are described in language that implies permanence without ever describing content. Working from Filippi's annotations, Hori's ethnographic research, and Aoki's Fudoki translations, scholars have assembled the 5-territory structure. The first territory is the threshold. It is the borderland where the newly dead linger before crossing fully into Yomi. This is the space the Kojiki describes directly, the entrance to the underground realm, the place where Izanagi's confrontation with Izanami occurs. the place where the great boulder is rolled. This territory is accessible, at least partially, to the living. Izanagi entered it. He survived it. He described what he saw. The second territory is where judgment or assessment occurs. Some regional Japanese traditions describe a figure called the Old Woman of Yomi at this boundary, an entity who receives the dead. Her function is administrative. She processes arrivals. She is not described as punishing anyone. Her role is sorting, not sentencing. The third territory is described in folk sources as a place of confrontation with the soul's own history. The living actions of the dead are present here in some form. The soul encounters what it did. The texts that reference this territory are oblique. They do not explain the mechanism. They note the presence of something like memory made external, made unavoidable. The fourth territory is the territory that stopped every scribe who tried to describe it. No regional tradition offers an account of what is found there. No returning figure in any Japanese text reports having entered it. No mourning practice addresses it directly. The Fudoki accounts from the provinces of Hitachi and Harima both reference the deeper territories of Yomi without naming their contents. Something is there. The tradition is consistent about its existence and consistent about the impossibility of reporting from it. It is not described as dark. It is not described as painful. It is described only through the absence of anyone who came back from it. The fifth territory is called Na no Kuni, the root country. It appears in the Kojiki in connection with the god Susanoo, who is exiled there. It is the deepest named stratum. Its name suggests depth rather than punishment. The root of a tree descends to where no light reaches, not as torment, but as condition. Na no Kuni is permanence without drama. It is the floor of the vertical cosmology. In the Sumerian system, the structure differs in number, but not in logic. The Descent of Inanna uses 7 gates rather than 5 territories. But the logic of progressive stripping, progressive loss of identity and retrievability is identical. And at the base of the Sumerian underworld sits a council of divine beings whose function is the permanent assignment of souls. These beings are the Anunnaki. The Anunnaki appear throughout Mesopotamian religious literature in 2 distinct roles. The distinction matters significantly for understanding what they do in the underworld. The Atrahasis epic, another Akkadian text dated to approximately 1700 BCE and translated by Stephanie Dalley in her 1989 Oxford University Press collection, describes the Anunnaki as a class of divine labourers. They performed cosmic maintenance work, they dug canals, they sustained the world. And eventually, after 3,600 years of unending labour, they rebelled. They burned their tools. They surrounded the chief god's dwelling. Their rebellion forced the creation of humanity as replacement workers. This is the Anunnaki of the creation mythology, the builders and administrators of the living world, the beings who found labour beneath them and passed it onto a species made from clay and divine blood. But in the underworld texts, the Anunnaki serve a different function entirely. The scholar Thorkild Jacobson, in his 1976 Yale University Press study of Mesopotamian religion, documented the theological transition in which the Anunnaki moved from cosmic labourers to judicial administrators of death. This shift is visible across different periods of Mesopotamian literature. The same beings who once dug canals and demanded relief from their burden now sit in the deepest territory of the afterlife as judges. By the time of the Gilgamesh epic, composed in its classic Akkadian form around 1200 BCE and published in Andrew George's definitive 2003 Oxford edition, the Anunnaki sit in the deepest territory of the underworld as a council of 7 judges. They receive the dead. They render verdicts. They assign souls to permanent categories of residency that do not permit exit. The council of 7 divine judges in the deepest stratum of the Mesopotamian underworld. The administrative figures at the assessment boundary in the second territory of the Japanese afterlife. Both systems place judicial entities at the threshold between the accessible and inaccessible territories of the dead. Both systems describe the territory below that threshold as unretrievable. The structural parallel across 2 traditions with no documented contact was noted by Joseph Campbell in his 1962 volume on Oriental mythology. Campbell attributed the convergence to universal human psychology. The descent narrative in his framework is a metaphor for sleep, death, seasonal change, and the experience of initiation. Every culture produces it independently, because every culture experiences the same psychological territory. Any people who bury their dead will eventually generate a cosmology of descent. Any cosmology of descent will eventually generate guardians, gates, and judgment. But the fourth Japanese realm resists this explanation. Universal metaphor produces universal features. It produces darkness, cold judgment, and the presence of the dead. It does not produce a specific architectural feature, a territory with no exit mechanism that appears in one tradition without appearing in others, without narrative explanation, without theological commentary, without mourning instruction. Egyptian cosmology describes judgment and passage. Greek mythology describes Tartarus as punishment. Norse tradition describes hell as a managed residency. None of these contains a territory defined structurally by inaccessibility alone, by the absence of any return mechanism whatsoever, with no moral justification attached. The fourth realm is not where the wicked go. The tradition does not say so. It simply does not say anyone comes back. The specificity of that silence is the anomaly. In 2012, Harvard comparative mythologist E.J. Michael Witzel published a book called The Origins of the World's Mythologies through Oxford University Press. Witzel had spent decades applying structural analysis to mythological traditions across Eurasia and beyond. His argument was that a shared narrative substrate, which he called Laurasian mythology, exists beneath the surface-level differences of unrelated mythological traditions across the entire breadth of the supercontinent. The creation, descent, underworld, and cosmic cycle narrative patterns that appear across Japanese, Mesopotamian, Greek, Norse, and Vedic traditions do not require contact between those cultures to explain their structural similarities. They share a common ancestor. That ancestor predates the dispersal of human populations across Eurasia. Witzel's framework places the origin of the shared substrate in the Upper Paleolithic, a minimum of 40,000 years ago and possibly older. Under Witzel's analysis, the Japanese 5-realm afterlife and the Mesopotamian 7-gate underworld are not copies of each other. They are both copies of something older than either of them. Both are regional expressions of a common original cosmological grammar. The structure of descent, judgment, permanent assignment, and unretrievable depth is not a Japanese invention or a Mesopotamian invention. It is a Laurasian inheritance, preserved in two literary traditions that happen to write it down on opposite ends of a continent. This framework is not fringe scholarship. Witzel holds a named chair at Harvard. His methodology draws on structural linguistics and comparative poetics, including the work of Calvert Watkins, who documented descent narrative motifs across Eurasian literary traditions in his 1995 Oxford study. The Laurasian thesis has critics. No hypothesis of this scope is without debate, but the existence of the structural parallels it attempts to explain is not contested. The parallels exist. The debate is about what produced them. What the fourth Japanese realm represents within this framework is the preservation of a specific theological concept that does not have an obvious psychological explanation. Universal metaphor accounts for the idea that the dead go somewhere. It accounts for the idea that some dead are judged. It does not account for a territory defined specifically by the impossibility of exit, not described as punishment, not described as torment, not described as non-existence, but described structurally as a place that holds what it receives and releases nothing. Tablet 12 of the Gilgamesh epic in Andrew George's translation contains the most direct Mesopotamian account of this concept. The ghost of Enkidu returns from the underworld and reports on the conditions of the dead to his friend Gilgamesh. They are sitting together in the ancient city of Uruk. Enkidu describes souls in varying conditions based on how many children they had when they died, how they died, whether they were mourned properly. Those who died in battle have a particular condition. Those who died young have another. Those whose bodies were cared for have a different situation from those left in the open. Each category of soul has a corresponding condition in the underworld. The report is detailed and specific. Enkidu has seen these things, he can describe them. And then the report ends without completing the inventory. At the bottom of Enkidu's account is a category he cannot fully describe. These are the souls for whom no one poured libations, no one mourned them, no one performed the funerary obligations that would maintain their connection to the living world. Enkidu sees them at the boundary of the deepest territory. He cannot report from within it. George's scholarly notes on Tablet 12 flag this as one of the more unusual features of the Gilgamesh underworld. The souls in the deepest stratum are not being punished. They are simply cut off from any mechanism of contact. Their status is not described as terrible, it is described as permanent. The word sometimes used in scholarly translations for their condition is abandoned. Not destroyed, not tortured, abandoned, beyond the reach of any communication in either direction. This is the concept the fourth Japanese realm preserves. The folk religious tradition documented by Hori describes the mourning obligations of the living toward the dead in terms that directly correspond to this Sumerian concept. Proper mourning maintains a soul's connection to the living world. Proper funerary practice ensures that the soul moves through the first and second territories of Yomi without becoming lodged permanently at a threshold it cannot pass. The souls who are not mourned, who have no family to perform the rituals, who died in places where no one knew to look for them, those souls travel deeper. In the third territory they confront what they did. Without the active connection of mourning from the living world above them, they cannot be held in place. They pass into the fourth territory, and the fourth territory does not release them. Both traditions are describing the same social function with the same cosmological architecture. Mourning is not a psychological comfort for the living. It is a structural necessity for the dead. The obligation to mourn is the mechanism that prevents souls from passing into the unretrievable depth. The fourth realm is not where the wicked go, it is where the forgotten go. The British Museum tablets sit in London behind climate-controlled glass. The Kojiki manuscripts, preserved in the archives of the Tokyo National Museum and in Shinto institutions across Japan, sit in Tokyo. Scholars at Oxford, at Harvard, and at the University of Tokyo continue to work on both traditions. Neither tradition is hidden, neither requires special access. The Descent of Inanna has been available in academic translation since the early 20th century. The Kojiki has been available in English since the translator B.H. Chamberlain published his edition in 1882, and in modern scholarly edition since Philippi's 1968 publication. The convergence between the two systems has been noted and discussed for decades. What has not been resolved is what to do with it. Witzel's Laurasian thesis offers one answer. Both traditions preserved a prehistoric original. The fourth realm in the Japanese system and the abandoned soul stratum in the Sumerian system are both local expressions of a concept that is at minimum 40,000 years old. If that is true, then the theological claim encoded in both traditions, that there is a territory of the dead defined by accessibility rather than punishment, is the oldest surviving cosmological idea in human history. Older than writing, older than agriculture, as old as the dispersal of the people who would eventually build both Nara and Nineveh. The Kojiki ends the Yomi sequence with an exchange at the sealed entrance. Izanami, standing on the inside of the boulder, tells Izanagi that she will kill 1,000 people in his country every day. Izanagi, standing on the outside, tells her that he will cause 1,500 births to answer her. 1,000 deaths, 1,500 births, the two of them at the sealed entrance to the Deadlands, negotiating the terms of mortality across the threshold between existence and its absence. The scribes who recorded this exchange were not writing poetry. They were recording the terms of a recognised arrangement. The dead have administration. The dead have governance. The arrangement has been agreed to. The boulder marks the boundary where the agreement holds. Whatever civilization preserved this cosmology believed that the dead were organised. It believed the organisation had structure, sequence, and a specific territory that the living were not equipped to enter and from which the dead did not return. The Anunnaki in the Sumerian system served as the administration of that territory. The thunder deities in the Japanese system served as the threshold guardians of its approach. And in both systems, below the last named guardian and below the last recorded verdict, sits the fourth territory, the place the texts do not describe, the place that does not return what it receives. 3,000 years of scholarship has not produced a better account of what it contains. The boulder at the entrance to Yomi is still sealed. The Anunnaki are still sitting in judgment in the deepest hall. And somewhere below the third territory of Yomi, below the place where the soul confronts what it did, there is a boundary that both traditions agree on without either of them having crossed it. The scribes of Uruk and the oral carriers of the Kojiki tradition did not know each other. They did not share a language, a trade route, or a god. What they shared was the boundary. The place where the map of the dead stops producing information. The place that every mourning practice, every funerary rite, every prayer and libation and grave offering was quietly designed to keep a soul from reaching. They knew the fourth realm existed. They knew what sent a soul there. And they knew, with a precision that no amount of scholarship has managed to soften, that nothing which entered it came back with a description. The boulder is still sealed. The Anunnaki are still sitting in the hall beneath everything. And the fourth territory is still where it has always been, one threshold past the last thing any living person has ever been able to see.